Some marriages are built on love. Others are built on desperation. New York City, winter of 1889. The Gilded Age, an era of glittering ballrooms and ruthless ambition, where fortunes are made overnight and lost just as quickly, where the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the destitute grows wider with each passing day. It's a time when industrial titans reshape America with iron and steel, when immigrant families chase the promise of prosperity, and when old money clings desperately to relevance in a world being remade by men with dirt under their fingernails and fire in their eyes. This is a world where appearance is everything, where a family's name can be their greatest asset or their final curse, and where a woman's future is often decided not by her dreams but by her father's debts. Hello, friend. If you're enjoying this romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like and a subscribe. My mum said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong and make it happen. It will also help me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you don't mind, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every comment and it always brings a smile to my face. Now let's get back to this amazing story. In the heart of Manhattan, on Madison Avenue where the wealthy display their power through limestone mansions and imported marble, the Sinclair family is quietly drowning. Their elegant townhouse, with its gaslit chandeliers and Persian rugs, with its library full of leather-bound books and its dining room that once hosted senators and industrialists, has become a beautiful lie, a stage set for a play that's already ended, though the actors don't yet know they've delivered their final lines. Catherine Sinclair stands at the frost-covered window of her father's study on a bitter February morning, her breath fogging the glass as she watches yet another creditor's carriage pull up to their door. She's 23 years old, intelligent beyond what society considers appropriate for a woman, beautiful in that understated way that makes men look twice, dark hair pinned in the latest fashion, gray eyes that miss nothing, a posture that speaks of breeding and education. She's wearing a day dress of deep burgundy that's 3 seasons old but still elegant, still proper, because the Sinclairs have mastered the art of appearing prosperous even as bankruptcy circles like vultures over carrion. Behind her, papers rustle with the frantic energy of a desperate man. Her father, Henry Sinclair, once a respected figure in New York banking circles, a man whose advice was sought by railroad magnates and shipping tycoons, now sits hunched over his desk like a question mark made flesh, surrounded by notices stamped in red ink that all say the same thing in different words: pay or face ruin. Catherine. His voice cracks on her name, and she turns from the window, schooling her features into calm even as her heart pounds against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release. We need to talk. But she already knows. She's known for weeks, piecing together the truth from overheard conversations and her father's increasingly hollow eyes, from the servants they've had to let go one by one with glowing references and severance pay they can't afford, from the way her mother has stopped ordering new dresses and started taking inventory of which jewelry might be sold without causing immediate scandal. Catherine has always had a head for numbers, a gift her father encouraged when she was young and found charming, teaching her to read financial reports and understand balance sheets, never imagining that one day she'd use those skills to calculate the exact dimensions of their disaster. $200,000. That's the number Henry Sinclair finally speaks aloud, and Catherine's knees nearly buckle because it's worse than she'd calculated, worse than her most pessimistic estimates. $200,000 in debts from railroad investments that turned out to be elaborate frauds, from business partners who proved to be con men with expensive suits and convincing smiles, from a trusting nature that has no place in the cutthroat world of Gilded Age finance. We have 3 weeks, her father continues, his hands shaking as he pours himself a brandy even though it's barely past noon. 3 weeks before it becomes public knowledge. Before the banks foreclose. Before your mother and I are. He doesn't finish, doesn't need to, because they both know what happens to once respected families who fall this far this fast. Debtor's prison for Henry. A charity home for her mother. Catherine herself would be fortunate to find work as a governess or companion to some wealthy family, spending her days teaching other women's children while her own dreams of love and partnership and a life of meaning dissolve like sugar in rain. But Catherine Sinclair has never been one to accept defeat without exploring every possible alternative, no matter how unpalatable. "There must be something we can do," she says, moving to sit across from her father, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Some asset we haven't considered. Some investment that might pay off." Henry cuts her off with a bitter laugh that holds no humor, only the sound of a man who's already examined every escape route and found them all blocked. "There's one option," he says slowly, and something in his tone makes Catherine's blood run cold. "I've received a proposition from Marcus Thorne." The name hangs in the air between them like smoke from a gun. Marcus Thorne. The Iron Baron. The self-made railroad magnate who came from nothing and built an empire through sheer will and ruthless business practices that make other industrialists look merciful by comparison. Marcus Thorne, who's featured in newspaper headlines at least once a week, usually accompanied by phrases like unprecedented expansion, or controversial labor practices, or social ambitions. Marcus Thorne, who's been a widower for 6 years and whose name is whispered in drawing rooms with a mixture of fascination and horror, because everyone knows the story of his first wife's tragic death, though the details shift depending on who's telling it. Catherine has seen his photograph in the society pages, a hard face, all sharp angles and colder angles, dark hair starting to silver at the temples, eyes that look through people rather than at them. He's 42 years old, immensely wealthy, and according to every account Catherine's heard, utterly devoid of human warmth. What kind of proposition? Catherine asks, though she already knows, can already feel the trap closing around her like iron jaws, because there's only one thing a man like Marcus Thorne would want from a family like theirs. Henry can't look at her as he explains. Marcus Thorne needs respectability. He needs access to old money social circles that have always looked down on him as an upstart, a commoner who made his fortune through backbreaking labor and sharp dealing rather than inheriting it from some ancestor who arrived on the Mayflower. He needs a wife from an established family, a woman who knows which fork to use and how to navigate society's unwritten rules, a woman whose name opens doors his money alone cannot. And in exchange for that social legitimacy, for a marriage that would give him the veneer of respectability he's always lacked, Marcus Thorne is willing to pay $200,000. Enough to settle every debt. Enough to save the Sinclair name. Enough to purchase one young woman's entire future. Catherine sits very still, processing this information with the same analytical mind she's applied to her father's failing investments, except now she's the asset being appraised, the commodity being sold to the highest bidder. Part of her wants to scream, to rage against the injustice of a world where women are trading pieces on a board controlled by men, where her education and intelligence and dreams matter less than her family name and her ability to look presentable at dinner parties. But another part of her, the practical part that's kept her functioning through months of mounting crisis, is already calculating the alternatives. She could refuse. She could maintain her dignity and her freedom and watch her father go to prison and her mother fade away in some charitable institution for impoverished gentlewomen. She could cling to her girlhood dreams of marrying for love, of finding a partner who values her mind as much as her name, and condemn her entire family to ruin for the sake of those dreams. Or she could do what women in her position have done for centuries, she could sacrifice herself on the altar of family duty and hope that somehow, some way, she survives the burning. "I need to think," Catherine says finally, standing, moving toward the door because she needs air, needs space, needs to be anywhere but in this study that smells of defeat and desperation. But her father's next words stop her cold. "His attorney is coming tomorrow for your answer. He's given us until then. 24 hours to decide the entire course of her life. 24 hours to choose between duty and desire, between family and self, between the known horror of poverty and the unknown horror of marriage to a man legendary for his coldness." Catherine nods once, sharply, and leaves the study, climbing the stairs to her bedroom on shaking legs, and once the door is closed behind her she allows herself exactly 5 minutes of tears before she dries her eyes, straightens her spine, and begins to research Marcus Thorne with the same thoroughness she'd apply to any important investment. Because if she's going to sell herself she'll at least know exactly what she's worth and exactly what she's buying. The New York Public Library becomes Catherine's refuge over the next hours, where she pores over newspaper archives and society columns and business journals, piecing together a portrait of the man who wants to purchase her future. Marcus Thorne was born in poverty, the son of Irish immigrants who died in a tenement fire when he was 12. He worked on railroad crews as a teenager, breaking his back laying track across the expanding nation, learning the business from the ground up in the most literal sense possible. By 25 he'd saved enough to buy his first rail line, a small, failing operation that he turned profitable through a combination of innovation and intimidation. By 30 he owned 3 lines. By 35 he'd become one of the most powerful men in American transportation, his network of railways stretching from New York to Chicago to the newly opened territories of the West. The newspapers call him visionary. They also call him ruthless. There are stories of workers who died building his railways, of safety standards ignored in favor of profit margins, of competitors crushed through tactics that hover just on the legal side of criminal. But there's also mention of fair wages compared to other industrialists, of a strict code of honor in business dealings, of contracts honored even when breaking them would be more profitable. And then there's Margaret. Margaret Chen, daughter of a successful Chinese merchant, an artist and activist who somehow captured the heart of the coldest man in New York. The society pages from 6 years ago are full of scandal, Marcus Thorne marrying outside his race, outside his social circle, choosing love over advantage in a way that shocked everyone who thought they knew him. The photographs from that time show a different Marcus Thorne, a man who actually smiled, whose eyes held something other than calculation. Margaret was beautiful, passionate about workers' rights and factory safety, using her new position as Marcus Thorne's wife to advocate for reforms that would save lives. And then she died in a factory fire, one of Marcus's own factories, trying to save trapped workers when the exits were locked and the safety measures she'd begged him to implement weren't in place. The newspapers delicately avoid assigning blame, but Catherine reads between the lines and understands, Marcus Thorne's cost-cutting killed his wife, and he spent 6 years punishing himself for it, locking away whatever capacity for love he once possessed and becoming the ice baron, the frozen duke, the man who looks at everything and everyone as pieces in a grand chess game where emotions are weaknesses to be exploited. This is the man who wants to marry her. This is the man who will pay $200,000 for the privilege of owning her name and her social connections while offering nothing in return except financial security and a loveless existence in a gilded cage. Catherine returns home as evening falls, her research complete, her decision made not through any revelation or moment of clarity but through simple, brutal logic. She finds her father in the study where she left him, the brandy bottle considerably emptier, his eyes red-rimmed with shame and grief. "I'll do it," Catherine says, and Henry Sinclair's face crumples with relief and horror in equal measure. "But I want to meet him first. I want to hear the terms directly from him, not through attorneys and intermediaries. If I'm going to sell myself, I'll at least look my buyer in the eye." The meeting is arranged for the following day at Marcus Thorne's Wall Street office, in a building of steel and glass that seems to scrape the sky itself, everything about it designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. Catherine dresses carefully in her finest remaining dress, a deep blue silk that brings out her eyes, her hair arranged in a style that's elegant but not frivolous, her jewelry minimal but real. She looks every inch the refined lady from an old family, which is precisely the point, precisely what she's selling. The elevator ride to the top floor feels like ascending to a guillotine, each passing number bringing her closer to the moment that will define the rest of her life. Marcus Thorne's secretary, a thin man with nervous eyes, shows her into an office that's all dark wood and leather, windows overlooking the city like a king surveying his kingdom, and behind a massive desk sits the man himself. Catherine's first thought is that the photographs don't capture it, the sheer presence of him, the way he seems to occupy more space than his physical form should allow, the sense that this is a man accustomed to being obeyed, to having the world bend to his will through force of personality if not force of wealth. He's not handsome in the classical sense, his features too harsh, too angular, like he was carved from stone by someone who prioritized strength over beauty. But there's something compelling about him, something that makes it hard to look away, and Catherine understands in that moment why Margaret Chen, with all her passion and idealism, might have fallen for him. Might have believed she could reach whatever humanity existed beneath that iron exterior. Marcus Thorne stands as she enters, a concession to manners, but doesn't come around the desk, maintaining the barrier between them. "Miss Sinclair. Please, sit." His voice is deep, controlled, the voice of a man who's learned to command through tone as much as words. Catherine sits, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, refusing to show fear or desperation even though both thrum through her veins. For a long moment they simply look at each other, appraising, calculating, two people about to enter a business arrangement evaluating the merchandise. Then Marcus Thorne speaks, and there's no preamble, no small talk, no pretense that this is anything other than what it is. "I'll pay your father's debts in full. In exchange, you'll marry me within the month. You'll serve as hostess for my social functions, you'll provide me with an heir, you'll give me access to the circles that have always considered me beneath them. Those are the terms." Catherine meets his eyes, those cold dark eyes that seem to see straight through her, and asks the question that matters most. "And what do I receive in return, beyond my family's salvation?" Something that might be respect flickers across Marcus Thorne's face, quickly suppressed. Financial security for life. A position of social prominence. The Thorne name, which despite its lack of pedigree has considerable power in this city. Freedom to pursue whatever interests you wish, within the bounds of propriety. He pauses, then adds with brutal honesty, "What you will not receive is affection. I will never love you, Miss Sinclair. I'm incapable of it. My heart died 6 years ago, and I have no intention of attempting resurrection." The words should hurt, but Catherine finds them almost refreshing in their honesty, so different from the polite lies and social pretenses that govern most interactions in her world. At least she knows exactly where she stands, exactly what she's agreeing to. No false hopes, no illusions, just the cold clarity of a contract negotiation. "And if I refuse?" she asks, though they both know she won't, both know she can't. Marcus Thorne leans back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Then I withdraw my offer." Your father faces his creditors, and the Sinclair name becomes a cautionary tale told in banking circles about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. "The choice is yours, Miss Sinclair. I'm simply presenting an alternative to ruin." Catherine thinks of her mother's face when she learned of their situation, the way years seem to add themselves overnight. She thinks of her father's shame, eating him alive from the inside. She thinks of her own dreams, already feeling like memories of someone else's life, something she once believed in before reality taught her better. "I accept your terms," Catherine says, her voice steady even as something inside her cracks and splinters like ice under pressure. "But I have one condition of my own. You say you'll never love me, and I believe you. You say your heart died with your first wife, and I accept that as truth. But I will not be invisible in my own life, Mr. Thorne. I will not fade into the wallpaper of whatever mansion you install me in. You may never love me, but you will acknowledge me. You will treat me with respect. You will recognize that while you may have bought my family's name and my social connections, I am not property to be used and discarded. Do we have an understanding?" For the first time since she entered the room, Marcus Thorne's expression shifts into something that might, in a different man, be called surprise. He studies her with new interest, as if seeing her for the first time as something other than a necessary acquisition. "We have an understanding, Miss Sinclair. I expected someone desperate and broken. You're neither of those things." He stands, extends his hand across the desk. "My attorney will contact your father with the paperwork. The wedding will be in 3 weeks at Trinity Church, Wall Street. I suggest you use that time to prepare yourself." Catherine takes his hand, feels the strength in his grip, the calluses that speak of his working-class origins no amount of wealth can erase, and she thinks about Margaret Chen, about whether Margaret's hand trembled the first time she touched this man, about whether she had any idea what she was signing up for when she agreed to marry the Iron Baron. The next 3 weeks pass in a blur of wedding preparations that feel more like funeral arrangements, Catherine moving through the process with mechanical efficiency while some part of her observes from a distance, already separating from the girl who once believed in love and partnership and building a life with someone who valued her mind as much as her name. Her mother cries while fitting her wedding dress, great silent tears that speak of all the dreams she had for her daughter, dreams that didn't include a loveless marriage to a man twice her age who admits up front that he'll never feel anything for her. Her father can't meet her eyes, his relief at their financial salvation poisoned by the guilt of knowing what it cost. Catherine endures it all with a grace that surprises even herself, making decisions about flowers and music and seating arrangements for a ceremony that will be attended by 600 people, none of whom are there to celebrate love but rather to witness a transaction, to see the Iron Baron purchase his way into society and the Sinclair girl sacrifice herself on the altar of family duty. The night before the wedding, Catherine stands in front of her bedroom mirror in the townhouse that will no longer be her home, studying her reflection like she's memorizing the face of someone about to disappear. She's wearing the nightgown that was part of her trousseau, white silk that cost more than most families spend in a year, paid for by her future husband as part of the arrangement. Tomorrow she'll walk down the aisle of Trinity Church Wall Street on her father's arm, and everyone will comment on how beautiful she looks, how composed, how perfectly she plays the role of blushing bride. No one will acknowledge that her eyes are empty, that her smile is painted on, that she's going to her wedding the way criminals go to their execution, with dignity but without hope. Catherine makes herself a promise in the reflection of that mirror. You may have married a convenience, but you will come to know a person. Marcus Thorne may never love you, but he will not ignore you. You will not fade away. You will not become a ghost in your own life. You will survive this, and somehow, some way, you will find meaning beyond being Mrs. Marcus Thorne. She doesn't know if it's a promise she can keep, but it's all she has, so she clings to it like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The wedding day dawns cold and clear, winter sunlight making the snow-covered city sparkle like it's been dusted with diamonds, nature providing the beauty that the actual ceremony lacks. Trinity Church Wall Street is magnificent, all Gothic Revival architecture and stained glass windows that paint rainbow patterns across stone floors, filled with 600 of New York's most influential citizens, all dressed in their finest, all there to witness the social event of the season. Catherine walks down the aisle on her father's trembling arm, seeing faces turn toward her with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to barely concealed judgment, and at the end of the aisle stands Marcus Thorne in a perfectly tailored suit, his face as expressionless as carved marble, looking at her the way a businessman looks at a contract about to be signed. The ceremony is traditional, the words ancient, the promises about love and honor and cherishing until death rings hollow when spoken by two people who barely know each other and have no intention of pretending otherwise. When the minister asks Marcus if he takes Catherine to be his wife, to love and to cherish, Marcus says, "I do," in the same tone he might use to approve a railroad route, and Catherine feels something inside her go numb, protecting her from the full weight of what she's done. The reception is held at the Waldorf Astoria, an elaborate affair with champagne that costs more per bottle than her family's servants earned in a month, with an orchestra playing waltzes, with a cake that's an architectural marvel of sugar and buttercream, with toasts that praise the happy couple without anyone actually claiming they're happy. Marcus dances with her once, required by tradition, and Catherine feels the eyes of 600 people watching them, judging whether this unlikely match might work, whether the Iron Baron has finally found someone who can thaw his frozen heart. If only they knew the truth, that this marriage isn't about thawing anything, it's about survival, about duty, about two people entering an arrangement that benefits them both while requiring nothing so messy and unpredictable as actual emotion. When Marcus's hand rests on her waist, it's proper, distant, the touch of someone handling a valuable object rather than a person. When they turn around the dance floor, they move in perfect synchronization because they're both performing, both giving the watching crowd exactly what they want to see. And when the dance ends and Marcus releases her with a slight nod before turning to speak with business associates, leaving her standing alone in her wedding dress in a room full of strangers who are now her peers, Catherine understands with perfect clarity that this is her life now. This performance, this careful distance, this elaborate pretense of a marriage that will never be anything more than a contract between two people who need each other for practical reasons but will never connect in any way that matters. The wedding night is exactly what Catherine expected, cold, perfunctory, devoid of anything resembling tenderness or passion. Marcus comes to her room in the hotel suite, performs his duty with mechanical efficiency, and leaves without unnecessary conversation, and Catherine lies in the darkness afterward thinking about all the stories she's read about wedding nights, about passion and discovery and the beginning of intimacy, and she almost laughs at the gap between fiction and her reality. This is what she sold herself for. This is what saving her family required. And she will endure it because endurance is all she has left, because she made a promise to herself not to disappear, and she will keep that promise even if it kills her. The next morning they travel to Ironwood Manor, Marcus's estate in the Hudson Valley, and Catherine gets her first glimpse of the prison where she'll spend the rest of her life. The house is magnificent in the way Gothic Revival mansions are magnificent, all stone and towers and dramatic architecture, perched on a cliff overlooking the Hudson River, surrounded by manicured grounds that stretch for acres. It's imposing, intimidating, designed to awe visitors and remind them of the owner's power and wealth. It's also, Catherine realizes as the carriage pulls up the long drive, utterly cold. Not just in temperature, though the February wind cutting off the river is bitter enough, but cold in spirit, in essence, a house that's given up on the idea of being a home and settled for being a monument to one man's success and isolation. Mrs. O'Brien, the head housekeeper, meets them at the door, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an expression that gives nothing away, and Catherine recognizes a fellow survivor, someone who's learned to navigate Marcus Thorne's world by being indispensable while remaining invisible. "Welcome to Ironwood Manor, Mrs. Thorne," Mrs. O'Brien says, and Catherine hears the test in those words, the question of whether she'll correct the title or accept it, whether she'll try to maintain her Sinclair identity or embrace her new position. "Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien," Catherine responds, accepting the name because what choice does she have, because Catherine Sinclair died the moment she said, "I do," and Mrs. Catherine Thorne is who she is now, for better or worse. The tour of the house takes an hour, room after magnificent room, each one more impersonal than the last, decorated with expensive taste and absolutely no warmth, no indication that anyone actually lives here rather than just occupying space between business trips. Catherine's rooms are in the East Wing, a suite of bedroom, sitting room, and dressing room that are larger than the entire floor plan of most homes, furnished with antiques and modern conveniences, everything she could possibly need for comfort. Marcus's rooms are in the West Wing, a deliberate separation that makes his intentions clear. They will share a name, share a house, share a life only in the most superficial ways, but they will not share anything deeper. There will be no accidental intimacy, no stumbling into connection through proximity. Even their sleeping arrangements are designed to maintain maximum distance. Catherine notices other things during the tour, the locked room that Mrs. O'Brien hurries past without explaining, the subtle way the servants watch their new mistress with curiosity and caution, the absolute silence that fills the house like something physical, like the building itself is holding its breath. That night, Catherine sits in her new sitting room, a fire crackling in the fireplace doing nothing to warm the chill in her bones, and she takes inventory of her life. She's 23 years old. She's married to one of the wealthiest men in America. She has security, comfort, a position of social prominence that most women would envy. And she's utterly, completely alone. Marcus is somewhere in the house, his study, most likely, working on the railroad expansion that occupies most of his attention, and he might as well be on another continent for all the connection they have. This is her future. This beautiful, comfortable, utterly empty future. Catherine opens her journal, the one she's kept since she was a girl, and she writes one sentence: "Today I married a ghost, and tomorrow I will learn to live with ghosts." But even as she writes it, she remembers her promise to herself. She will not disappear. She will not fade into the wallpaper. She will survive this, and somehow, impossibly, she will find a way to be more than just Mrs. Marcus Thorne, more than just the woman who saved her family by selling herself to the Iron Baron. She doesn't know how yet. She doesn't know if it's even possible. But she'll try, because trying is all she has left, because the alternative is becoming as frozen as her husband, as cold as this house, as dead inside as the life she's now living. And Catherine Sinclair, no, Catherine Thorne, has never been very good at accepting defeat. The question is, when a marriage begins with ice, can warmth ever take root? Or are some hearts too frozen to ever feel the sun again? What will it take to crack the Iron Baron's carefully constructed walls, and when they finally break, will what's inside be worth the shattering? The accident happened on a Tuesday evening, and it changed everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before Marcus Thorne's carefully constructed walls could shatter, they first had to develop cracks, hairline fractures so subtle that even he didn't notice them forming until it was far too late to stop what was coming. Spring arrived at Ironwood Manor the way spring always does in the Hudson Valley, reluctantly, fighting winter for every degree of warmth, every blade of grass pushing through frozen ground, every bud on every tree a small victory against the cold. Catherine had been living as Mrs. Marcus Thorne for 2 months, 63 days to be exact, though she'd stopped counting after the first month when she realized that marking time only made it move slower, only emphasized how many more days stretched ahead of her in this beautiful prison. She'd fallen into a routine, because humans are adaptable creatures and even the most unbearable situations become bearable through repetition, through the numbing comfort of knowing what comes next. Marcus left for his Wall Street office 3 days a week, staying overnight at his city residence, working on railroad expansions and business deals that would expand his empire even further. When he was home, they maintained their careful distance, formal dinners where conversation stayed safely on topics like weather and current events, never straying into anything personal, never risking actual connection. But something was shifting, imperceptibly at first, like the season changing 1 degree at a time. Catherine had won over the household staff through simple kindness and genuine interest in their lives, learning that Mrs. O'Brien had a daughter studying to be a teacher, that the head gardener grew prize-winning roses, that the young kitchen maid dreamed of opening her own restaurant someday. She'd taken over management of the household accounts with an efficiency that impressed even Marcus, catching errors and finding savings in ways that demonstrated she'd inherited her father's gift for numbers even if she'd also inherited his tragic judgment in business partners. She'd started hosting small afternoon teas for the wives of Marcus's business associates, carefully building the social connections he'd married her to provide, playing the role of gracious hostess with a skill that made it look effortless even though every interaction left her exhausted from the performance. And Marcus had begun to notice her, really notice her, in ways that went beyond the polite acknowledgement of her existence. It started small, a comment about how well she'd handled a difficult dinner guest, a question about her opinion on a piece of art he was considering purchasing for the entrance hall, a moment of eye contact that lasted a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary. Catherine told herself these small shifts meant nothing, that she was reading significance into courtesy, that Marcus Thorne was simply adjusting to having another person in his previously solitary existence and nothing more. But late at night, lying in her bed in the East Wing while he presumably lay in his in the West Wing, she couldn't help wondering what it would take to reach the man behind the iron facade, whether the Marcus Thorne who'd once loved Margaret Chin enough to defy social convention still existed somewhere beneath the frozen exterior, or whether he'd died along with his first wife and what remained was just an extremely convincing automaton going through the motions of human existence. She'd learned more about Margaret in those 2 months, piecing together her story from careful questions to Mrs. O'Brien and observation of the locked room that had been Margaret's studio, the room Marcus kept exactly as she'd left it 6 years ago, preserved like a shrine to guilt and grief. Margaret Chen had been an artist, passionate and idealistic, using her marriage to the Iron Baron to advocate for factory workers' rights, for safety regulations, for treating employees as human beings rather than expendable resources. And she died in flames trying to save those workers when one of Marcus's factories caught fire, when the safety exits she'd begged him to install remained locked, when the precautions she'd pleaded for weren't in place because they cut into profit margins. How does a man live with that kind of guilt? How does someone wake up every morning knowing that his own choices, his own cost-cutting decisions, his own prioritization of money over lives killed the person he loved most? Catherine began to understand that Marcus's coldness wasn't cruelty, it was protection, a fortress built around a wound so deep that the slightest touch might cause it to hemorrhage, might destroy what little of him survived Margaret's death. Understanding him didn't mean forgiving the way he treated her, didn't excuse the emotional desert of their marriage, but it gave her something she hadn't had before, context, and with context came the dangerous seed of sympathy. Spring deepened into early summer, and with it came Catherine's first major test as Marcus Thorne's wife, hosting a garden party at Ironwood Manor for 50 of New York's most influential families, the same people who'd watched her marry the Iron Baron with expressions ranging from pity to contempt, the same social circle she'd been born into but now occupied from a different position, no longer the respected Sinclair daughter but the woman who'd sold herself for her family's salvation. Catherine spent weeks preparing, working with Mrs. O'Brien to ensure every detail was perfect, transforming the manor's grounds into something approaching magical with string quartets and imported flowers and refreshments that would satisfy even the most demanding palates. The day of the party arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself had decided to cooperate, and Catherine dressed in a gown of pale green silk that made her look like part of the garden itself, ethereal and untouchable, every inch the society hostess. Marcus was supposed to make a brief appearance and then retreat to his study. That was the plan they'd agreed upon, maintaining the fiction of his presence without requiring him to actually engage with the social niceties that bored him. But something unexpected happened. Marcus stayed. He remained at Catherine's side through the afternoon, making conversation with business associates and their wives, actually laughing at someone's joke about railroad politics, playing the role of attentive husband with an ease that shocked everyone present, especially Catherine herself. She caught him watching her several times throughout the event, his expression unreadable but intent, as if he were seeing her for the first time, as if she'd somehow transformed from a necessary acquisition into an actual person worthy of his attention. When elderly Mrs. Astor, the queen of New York society, commented that Catherine must have worked miracles to make Ironwood Manor feel warm and welcoming, Marcus responded without hesitation, "My wife has many talents, Mrs. Astor. I'm fortunate she agreed to share them with me." It was a small thing, those few words, but they sent a shock through Catherine's system because he'd never called her "my wife" with anything approaching warmth before, never acknowledged her as anything more than a fixture in his house. After the guests departed and the staff cleared away evidence of the party, Catherine found herself in the library, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, and Marcus appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of champagne, wordlessly offering her one. They stood by the window overlooking the Hudson as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and for the first time since their wedding, comfortable silence stretched between them instead of the usual awkward void. "You were remarkable today," Marcus said finally, his voice lower than usual, rougher, almost intimate. "I've attended hundreds of social functions, and most of them are exercises in tedious obligation. But today, watching you navigate conversations, remembering everyone's names and their children's names and asking questions that actually mattered to them, I realized something." He paused, and Catherine held her breath, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast, whatever moment this was. "I realized I underestimated you. I thought I was acquiring social connections and a competent hostess. I didn't expect." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Intelligence," Catherine finished for him, unable to keep a slight edge from her voice. "You didn't expect intelligence. Or personality. Or anything beyond a decorative wife who knew which fork to use." Marcus turned to face her fully, and in the dying light his features looked softer somehow, less carved from stone and more flesh and blood. "I expected competence," he corrected. "What I didn't expect was to find myself interested in your opinions, curious about your thoughts, wanting to know what you really think about the books you read and the art you look at and the world you navigate with such grace." It was the most personal thing he'd said to her since their wedding day, and Catherine felt something dangerous unfurl in her chest, hope, that treacherous emotion she tried so hard to suppress, because hope meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant the capacity to be hurt, and she'd promised herself she wouldn't give Marcus Thorne the power to wound her any more than he already had through simple indifference. "I think," Catherine said slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing a bomb, "that you're lonely, Marcus. I think you've been lonely for 6 years, and hosting a party reminded you what it feels like to be part of the world instead of just observing it from behind walls you've built so high that even you can't see over them anymore." She expected him to retreat, to rebuild the ice, to shut down this moment of genuine connection because it came too close to the truth. Instead, Marcus laughed, a short, bitter sound that held more pain than humor. "Lonely," he repeated. "That's one word for it. Mrs. O'Brien calls it self-imposed exile. My business associates call it focused dedication. I call it survival, because the alternative to feeling nothing is feeling everything, and I learned 6 years ago that feeling everything will destroy you. Before Catherine could respond, before she could push further into this unprecedented openness, Marcus set down his champagne glass and moved toward the door, already retreating, already regretting whatever moment of weakness had allowed him to be honest. "Thank you for today," he said without turning back. "You exceeded every expectation. Good night, Catherine." And he was gone, leaving her standing by the window with her own champagne untouched, wondering if she'd imagined the whole conversation, if the cracks she thought she'd seen in his armor were just wishful thinking, projection of her own desperate need for this marriage to be something more than the cold transaction it had started as. But she hadn't imagined it, and in the days that followed, those cracks widened incrementally. Marcus began working from home more often, his study door left open instead of firmly closed, and sometimes Catherine would walk past and find him looking up from his papers, catching her eye, almost smiling before remembering himself and returning to work. They started playing chess in the library in the evenings, a silent battle of strategy where Catherine won more often than not, and Marcus seemed to respect her more with each victory rather than less, as if her intelligence challenged him in ways he hadn't been challenged in years. The physical awareness between them grew harder to ignore, hands brushing when passing documents, the electric moment when Marcus helped her navigate a muddy path in the garden and his hand lingered at her waist, the way his eyes tracked her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. Catherine felt herself responding despite her best intentions, despite knowing that wanting something from Marcus Thorne was asking for heartbreak, because she'd seen what happened to people he loved and she had no desire to end up as another shrine to his guilt. But desire doesn't listen to reason, and with each small intimacy, each moment of genuine connection, she felt herself falling into the most dangerous trap of all, believing that maybe, just maybe, the ice baron could thaw, that the man who'd once loved deeply enough to defy society for Margaret Chen might learn to love again. Then came the invitation to Mrs. Vanderbilt's summer ball, the social event of the season, 800 guests and enough gossip fuel to power New York society for months, and Catherine knew this would be a test, of her position as Marcus's wife, of whether society would accept her as anything more than a desperate girl who'd sold herself for her family's debts, of whether the fragile connection developing between her and Marcus could survive public scrutiny. The night of the ball arrived with oppressive heat, the kind of thick, humid evening where even breathing feels like work, and Catherine dressed in a gown of deep sapphire that made her skin glow, her hair arranged in the latest fashion, looking every inch the railroad magnate's wife, confident and sophisticated and utterly in control even though her stomach churned with nerves. Marcus met her at the base of the stairs, and for just a moment, something flashed in his eyes that looked almost like awe before he schooled his expression back to neutral. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and then offered his arm, and they went to face society together. The Vanderbilt mansion was blazing with light, every window illuminated, every surface gilded, wealth displayed so ostentatiously that it bordered on vulgar, but this was the Gilded Age and subtlety had no place in a world where displaying your fortune was more important than good taste. 800 people filled the ballrooms and parlors and gardens, all dressed in their finest, all performing the elaborate dance of society where every conversation had subtext and every compliment might hide an insult and reputation could be destroyed with a well-placed whisper. Catherine and Marcus entered to the kind of attention that makes skin prickle, every eye in the room tracking their progress, and Catherine heard the whispers start immediately. "That's the Sinclair girl who married him for money. I heard her family was completely ruined. She's done well for herself, considering. Do you think he actually cares for her or is it just for show?" She kept her head high, her expression serene, her hand light on Marcus's arm, giving them nothing, absolutely nothing to work with, playing the roles so perfectly that even the most skeptical observers would have trouble finding fault. And then James Whitmore appeared, Marcus's longtime business associate, charming and witty with an easy smile that suggested he'd never known hardship, never spent sleepless nights wondering how to pay debts or whether society would accept him. "Marcus, you're monopolizing your lovely wife," James said after the required pleasantries, his tone teasing but with an undercurrent Catherine couldn't quite identify. "Surely you can spare her for one dance." It was a test, Catherine realized, and not just of her but of Marcus, because in society's complicated rules, a husband who refused to let his wife dance with other gentlemen looked possessive and jealous, suggesting the marriage might actually involve real feeling, while a husband who didn't care who his wife danced with looked indifferent, suggesting the marriage was exactly the cold transaction everyone suspected. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he released Catherine's arm with a slight nod. Of course. Catherine, enjoy your dance. But there was something in his voice, an edge that hadn't been there before, and as James led her onto the dance floor, Catherine glanced back to see Marcus watching them with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something that looked dangerously close to jealousy. James Whitmore was an excellent dancer, guiding her through the waltz with practiced ease, and he was funny, genuinely funny, making observations about the other guests that had Catherine laughing despite herself, the first real laughter she'd experienced at a social function since her marriage. "You're good for him, you know," James said as they turned across the floor. "Marcus. I've known him for 15 years, watched him build his empire, watched him fall in love with Margaret, watched him die inside when he lost her. These past few months, since you came into his life, I've seen glimpses of the man he used to be. Small moments, but they're there. You're reaching him, whether you realize it or not." Catherine wanted to protest, to say that reaching Marcus Thorne was impossible, that she was just a convenience he'd purchased to smooth his social interactions, but before she could respond, she felt eyes burning into her back and turned her head slightly to see Marcus standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching them with an intensity that made her breath catch. He wasn't just watching, he was staring, his hands clenched at his sides, his expression dark with something Catherine had never seen directed at her before, want, and the fury of wanting, and the terror of wanting something you've sworn never to want again. The dance ended, and before James could escort Catherine back to Marcus, before she could process what she'd seen in her husband's face, Marcus was there, cutting through the crowd with determined strides, claiming her with a hand at her waist that was far from the polite touch society required. "My turn," he said, not quite a question, and suddenly Catherine was in his arms as the orchestra started a new waltz, and the entire ballroom seemed to fade away until it was just the two of them, moving in perfect synchronization, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the pulse jumping in his throat, could feel the tension coiled in every muscle as if he were holding himself back from something with every ounce of his considerable will. "You were enjoying that dance," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question but almost an accusation, and Catherine felt a spark of anger cut through the haze of physical awareness. "I was being polite," she responded coolly. "James Whitmore is your friend and colleague. Would you have preferred I insult him by refusing?" "I would have preferred," Marcus said, his voice dropping to something rough and low that sent shivers down Catherine's spine, "that he not make you laugh like that. That he not look at you like. He trailed off, seeming to realize what he was revealing, and his grip on her waist tightened almost painfully before he forced himself to relax. "Like what, Marcus?" Catherine pushed, because they were in the middle of a crowded ballroom and he couldn't retreat, couldn't disappear into his study or hide behind his walls, he had to stand here and dance with her and maybe, finally, admit something real. "Say it. Like a man who finds me interesting. Like someone who might actually want to know me as a person rather than as a social asset." The muscle in Marcus's jaw jumped, and for a moment Catherine thought he might actually walk away, might abandon her in the middle of the dance floor in front of 800 witnesses, but instead he pulled her fractionally closer, bending his head so his words were for her alone. "Like a man who might fall in love with you," he said, each word forced out like a confession under torture. "And I find I'm not nearly as indifferent to that possibility as I should be. As I need to be. As I promised myself I would be." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain Marcus must feel it, must hear it, must know that his words had just shattered something inside her that she'd carefully kept frozen since their wedding day. "Are you jealous, Marcus?" she asked, needing to hear him say it, needing confirmation that this wasn't just her imagination, that the connection she'd felt developing between them was real and not just wishful thinking. "Jealous," Marcus repeated, turning the word over like he was examining it from all angles, testing its weight and meaning. "I told myself I'd never feel that again. Never feel anything again. It's safer that way. Cleaner. But watching James make you smile, watching you respond to him with a lightness you never show with me, yes, Catherine, I was jealous, and I hate myself for it because jealousy means caring and caring means vulnerability and vulnerability means I could lose you the way I lost Margaret and I would rather spend the rest of my life frozen than risk that kind of pain again. It was the most honest he'd ever been with her, maybe the most honest he'd been with anyone since Margaret's death, and Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized they were standing on the edge of something that would change everything, for better or worse. The waltz ended, but Marcus didn't immediately release her, and for a heartbeat they stood frozen while around them couples separated and the next dance formed, and Catherine saw in his eyes the battle between desire and fear, between the man who'd once loved deeply and the man who'd vowed never to love again. Then, slowly, Marcus released her and stepped back, the distance between them growing from inches to feet, physical space representing the emotional chasm he was desperately trying to maintain. "Thank you for the dance, Mrs. Thorne," he said formally, and the use of her title after the intimacy of his confession felt like a slap. He turned away, moving toward a group of businessmen discussing railroad politics, rebuilding his walls brick by brick even as Catherine stood alone in the middle of the ballroom feeling like she'd just been shown a glimpse of treasure before having the door slammed in her face. But if Catherine thought the evening's complications were over, she was catastrophically wrong, because approaching her through the crowd, elegant and predatory, came a woman she'd never met but somehow immediately recognized from photographs she'd found during her research into Marcus's past. Vivian Chen, Margaret's younger sister, shared enough of Margaret's features that the resemblance was unmistakable, the high cheekbones, the dark hair, the slender build, but where Margaret had been known for warmth and compassion, Vivian's smile was all sharp edges and calculation. "Mrs. Thorne," Vivian said, the name dripping with something between mockery and menace. "How delightful to finally meet you. I'm Vivian Chen, though I suppose Marcus has mentioned me." But Catherine knew immediately that Marcus had done no such thing, had never mentioned Vivian at all, which raised the question of why. "Miss Chen," Catherine responded carefully, every instinct screaming danger but maintaining perfect composure because they were in public and any sign of discord would fuel gossip for months. "Marcus has told me about Margaret, of course. She sounded like a remarkable woman. You must miss her terribly." It was the right thing to say, sympathetic and genuine, but Vivian's smile sharpened into something almost predatory. The words were perfectly pitched to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Anyone overhearing would hear a bereaved sister making an innocent if pointed comment, but Catherine heard the threat underneath, the suggestion that Catherine should ask questions Marcus wouldn't want to answer. Before Catherine could formulate a response, Vivian continued, her voice dropping to something more intimate, more dangerous. "We should have tea sometime, you and I. I have so much to tell you about your husband. Things I'm sure he'd prefer you didn't know. Things about Margaret's death, about the payments he's been making me for years to keep certain information quiet. You seem like an intelligent woman, Catherine, may I call you Catherine? I think you deserve to know the full truth about the man you married." She pressed a calling card into Catherine's hand, her smile never wavering. "Think about it. I'm sure we have much to discuss." And then she was gone, melting back into the crowd, leaving Catherine standing with a business card that felt like it was burning through her glove, her mind racing with questions and suspicions and the terrible certainty that whatever Vivian Chen had to say would shatter the fragile progress Catherine had made in understanding Marcus, in building something resembling connection with the Ice Baron who was slowly, grudgingly beginning to thaw. What secrets was Marcus Thorne paying to keep buried? What had really happened the day Margaret Chen died, and why was her sister blackmailing the man who'd supposedly loved her? And most dangerously of all, was Catherine falling in love with a man who might be far more culpable in his first wife's death than she'd realized? These questions haunted her as she and Marcus made their excuses and left the ball early, riding home in silence thick with everything unsaid, with his confession of jealousy hanging between them like smoke, with Vivian Chen's calling card hidden in Catherine's reticule like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. But before Catherine could decide whether to meet with Vivian, before she could confront Marcus about the blackmail payments, before any of those complications could play out, fate intervened in the most unexpected way possible. Because 2 days after the Vanderbilt ball, Catherine took a carriage into the city to clear her head, to escape Ironwood Manor's increasingly claustrophobic walls and the weight of secrets and developing feelings that terrified her more than indifference ever had. She rode along the waterfront as evening fell, watching the sun set over the Hudson, trying to sort through the tangle of her thoughts. Should she trust Vivian Chen? Should she trust Marcus? Should she trust her own feelings when everything she'd learned about love and marriage had proven unreliable? And then, without warning, a factory near the waterfront exploded, a boiler malfunction that sent fire and debris into the air and panicked the horses pulling Catherine's carriage into a bolt of pure terror. The driver lost control, the carriage overturned with a sickening crunch of wood and screaming of horses, and Catherine felt herself thrown, felt the impact of something hard against her skull, felt pain bloom like fire behind her eyes before darkness crashed over her in waves and she knew nothing at all. When Marcus Thorne received word that his wife had been in an accident, that she was injured and possibly dying at Manhattan Hospital, something inside him that had been frozen solid for 6 long years shattered into 1,000 cutting pieces. And for the first time since Margaret's death, the Ice Baron felt everything. Can a man who's spent 6 years teaching himself not to feel learn to feel again in time to save what matters most? Marcus Thorne abandoned a boardroom full of investors mid-sentence when his assistant burst through the door with news of the accident, something the man had never done in 20 years of building his empire, something so unprecedented that the men around the table sat in stunned silence as the Iron Baron, the man legendary for his composure, for his ability to negotiate million-dollar deals without showing a flicker of emotion, went pale as death and ran. He didn't walk, didn't maintain dignity, didn't concern himself with appearance or protocol or anything except getting to Manhattan Hospital as fast as humanly possible, and if anyone had seen his face during that carriage ride they would have witnessed something remarkable. Marcus Thorne, terrified. Not the calculated concern of a man worried about losing a valuable asset, not the mild distress of someone facing an inconvenience, but raw, primal terror, the kind that strips away every defense and leaves nothing but the truth. The truth was that somewhere in the past months, somewhere between chess games in the library and watching Catherine handle society matrons with intelligence and grace, somewhere between feeling jealous at a ball and confessing that jealousy, Marcus Thorne had broken his own most sacred rule. He'd started to care. And now, racing through New York streets as evening gave way to night, he was paying the price for caring, feeling every emotion he'd locked away for 6 years crashing over him in waves that threatened to drown him. Manhattan Hospital loomed ahead, all brick and institutional efficiency, and Marcus burst through the doors demanding to see his wife with an urgency that had nurses scrambling and doctors rushing to provide information. Catherine Sinclair Thorne, 23 years old, carriage accident, head trauma, internal injuries, broken ribs, condition critical. The next 48 hours would determine whether she survived or joined the countless other victims of industrial-age accidents that claimed lives daily in their rapidly modernizing world. Marcus found himself in a private room where Catherine lay impossibly still, impossibly pale against white hospital linens, her dark hair spread across the pillow, a bandage wrapped around her head where she'd struck something during the crash, her breathing shallow but steady, and for the first time since Margaret's death Marcus Thorne prayed. He didn't know if he believed anymore, didn't know if there was anyone listening, but he prayed anyway because what else could he do, what else did he have except words thrown into the void begging for mercy he probably didn't deserve. He pulled a chair to her bedside and took her hand, that small hand that had grown calloused from working in the Manor's gardens, that had beat him at chess more times than he cared to admit, that had brushed against his accidentally and sent electricity through his entire system, and he held it like it was the only thing tethering him to sanity. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, each minute lasting an eternity, and Marcus didn't leave her side, didn't eat, didn't sleep, just sat and watched Catherine breathe and remembered every conversation they'd had, every moment of connection he'd tried so hard to dismiss as insignificant. He remembered the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day, resignation mixed with determination, a woman sacrificing herself but refusing to be broken by that sacrifice. He remembered her voice during their first real conversation when she demanded respect if not love, setting boundaries he'd actually found himself wanting to honor. He remembered the garden party where she transformed Ironwood Manor from a mausoleum into something approaching alive, where he'd caught himself thinking that maybe, possibly, life without Margaret didn't have to mean life without anything. He remembered the jealousy that had consumed him watching James Whitmore make her laugh, the confession he'd made in the middle of a crowded ballroom that had terrified him even as the words left his mouth. And he realized, sitting in that hospital room with Catherine's hand in his, that he'd been lying to himself for months. He didn't care about Catherine despite his vows never to care again. He was falling in love with her, had probably been falling in love with her since the moment she'd refused to be invisible in her own life, and the thought of losing her now, just when he was beginning to understand what he felt, was unbearable in ways that made Margaret's death feel like a different lifetime's pain. On the second day, Catherine's eyes opened, unfocused and confused, and she whispered, "I'm sorry I'm not her," before drifting back into unconsciousness, and those 5 words shattered something in Marcus because they revealed what he'd never allowed himself to consider, that Catherine knew she was living in Margaret's shadow, that she'd spent months trying to measure up to a ghost, that she thought his inability to love her was about her inadequacy rather than his fear. When she woke again, hours later, more alert this time, Marcus was still there, unshaven and exhausted and human in ways she'd never seen him, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Don't leave. Please don't leave." Catherine, still foggy from pain medication and trauma, managed a weak smile. "I signed a contract, remember? I'm not going anywhere." But Marcus shook his head, leaning closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't care about the contract. I care about you. I care that you might have died and I never told you that somewhere along the way you stopped being an arrangement and started being the most important part of my day. I care that watching you lie here terrified me more than anything has terrified me in 6 years. I care, Catherine, and I spent so long teaching myself not to care that I don't know how to do this, don't know how to be what you deserve, but I want to try if you'll let me." It wasn't a declaration of love, not quite, because Marcus Thorne was still too broken, still too afraid to use that word, but it was more honesty than Catherine had ever expected from him, more vulnerability than she dared hope for, and tears slid down her face as she squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "I thought you'd be relieved," she whispered. "If I died. One less complication in your perfectly ordered life." The look of pain that crossed Marcus's face was so raw, so genuine, that Catherine immediately regretted the words, but he didn't retreat, didn't rebuild his walls, just shook his head slowly. "The only thing my life had before you was order. It didn't have warmth. It didn't have laughter. It didn't have someone who beat me at chess and made me actually enjoy losing. You think you're a complication, but you're the first thing that's made my life feel like living instead of just existing since Margaret died." He paused, struggling with words, with emotions he'd suppressed for so long they felt foreign on his tongue. "I don't know if I can love again the way I loved her. I don't know if that capacity survived. But I know that losing you would destroy whatever's left of me, and I know that's not nothing. It's not enough, but it's not nothing." Catherine's recovery took weeks, weeks of Marcus visiting daily with books and flowers and terrible attempts at humor that made her laugh despite the pain in her ribs, weeks of slowly rebuilding her strength while simultaneously discovering that the Ice Baron could be tender, could be patient, could sit quietly and read aloud from novels when she was too tired to read herself. The household staff at Ironwood Manor whispered among themselves about the change in their employer, how he smiled more, how he'd insisted Catherine's rooms be moved closer to his so he could check on her during the night, how he'd fired a maid who'd made an insensitive comment about the accident. Mrs. O'Brien, who'd served the Thorne household for 15 years, confided to the cook that she'd never seen Marcus like this, not even with Margaret, because with Margaret he'd been passionately in love but also young and uncertain, while with Catherine he loved with the desperation of a man who'd already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. But just as Catherine began to believe that maybe their marriage could become something real, something built on genuine connection rather than financial necessity, a letter arrived that threatened to destroy the fragile peace they'd built. Vivian Chen had been patient, had waited through Catherine's hospitalization and recovery, but now she wanted her answer. Would Catherine meet to discuss the truth about Marcus's role in Margaret's death, or would Vivian be forced to take her information public? Catherine sat in the library at Ironwood Manor, now strong enough to move around the house, and stared at Vivian's letter with a growing sense of dread, because she'd started to hope, had begun to believe that Marcus's feelings were genuine and their future might hold something approaching happiness. And now she had to decide whether to trust him completely or investigate claims that might reveal he was far more culpable in Margaret's death than she'd realized. Could she build a life with a man who might have killed his first wife through negligence? Could she love someone capable of valuing profit over human lives? But hadn't he changed? Hadn't the past weeks shown her a different Marcus, one who'd been shaped by tragedy into someone who'd never make the same mistakes again? These questions tormented her until finally, unable to bear the uncertainty, Catherine made a decision that would force everything into the open. She searched Marcus's study late one night while he slept, feeling guilty for the invasion of privacy but needing answers, and what she found both confirmed Vivian's claims and complicated them beyond measure. Ledgers showing payments to VC for years, totaling tens of thousands of dollars. Documents detailing the factory fire investigation. And most damning, a letter from Margaret written the day before she died, begging Marcus to install safety exits at the factory, warning him that workers were in danger, pleading with him to choose lives over profits. He'd ignored her warning. 24 hours later, she was dead along with 12 factory workers, and Marcus had spent 6 years paying Vivian Chen to keep certain details quiet, specifically, that Margaret had warned him and he dismissed her concerns as naive idealism. Catherine confronted Marcus the next morning over breakfast, unable to carry the weight of knowledge alone any longer, and his face went carefully blank when she showed him Vivian's letter and admitted she'd searched his study. For a long moment he said nothing, and Catherine braced herself for anger, for denial, for the return of the ice baron who would shut her out completely, but instead Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and said 3 words that changed everything: "It's all true." He didn't make excuses, didn't minimize his responsibility, just told her the story from beginning to end, how Margaret had become passionate about worker safety after visiting his factories, how she'd compiled reports and evidence and pleaded with him to make changes that would cost money and slow production, how he dismissed her concerns as the naive idealism of someone who didn't understand business, how he'd been in a board meeting when the fire started and Margaret had rushed to the factory because she'd heard workers were trapped, how she died trying to save people from a disaster he'd been warned about and ignored. "Vivian Chen has been blackmailing me since Margaret's funeral," Marcus continued, his voice flat with the careful control of someone confessing to crimes. "She threatened to go to the newspapers with proof that I'd been warned and did nothing. It would have destroyed me, destroyed the railroad, destroyed everything I'd built. So I paid her, and I've been paying her ever since, and every payment reminds me that I bought Margaret's death with my own arrogance." Catherine listened to this confession feeling like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, because on one hand this was exactly what she'd feared, confirmation that Marcus had directly contributed to his first wife's death through criminal negligence, but on the other hand, the guilt and self-loathing in his voice, the 6 years of penance and isolation, suggested this wasn't a man incapable of conscience but rather one consumed by it. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked finally. "Why let me discover it this way?" Marcus met her eyes, and in them Catherine saw exhaustion, the weariness of carrying guilt for years without relief. "Because I'm a coward. Because telling you meant risking exactly what's happening now, you looking at me and realizing you married a man responsible for 12 deaths including his own wife's. Because I was starting to care about you and I couldn't bear the thought of you knowing the worst parts of me." He stood, moving toward the window, his back to her. "Vivian wants more money. She'll always want more money, because blackmail doesn't end, it just escalates. I've been paying for 6 years and I'll be paying until I die or she does, and that's the life I'm offering you, married to a man who killed his first wife and will be hemorrhaging money to her sister forever to keep that truth quiet." The weight of this revelation should have crushed Catherine, should have made her regret every moment of softening toward Marcus, every instance of believing he might be capable of change, but instead she found herself thinking about the man who'd sat by her hospital bed for 3 days without sleeping, who'd confessed his fear of losing her, who'd been tender during her recovery in ways that suggested his capacity for love hadn't died with Margaret but had only gone dormant, waiting for someone to wake it again. "No," Catherine said, and Marcus turned, confusion crossing his features. "No," he repeated. "No, you won't be paying Vivian Chen for the rest of your life, because we're going to end this," Catherine explained, standing, moving to face him directly. "We're going to expose everything publicly, on our terms, before she can use it against us. We're going to acknowledge your responsibility for Margaret's death, establish a worker safety fund in her name, implement the reforms she died trying to achieve, and take away Vivian's power by making truth our weapon instead of letting her use it as hers." Marcus stared at her like she'd suggested they burn Ironwood Manor to the ground. "That will destroy my reputation. My business relationships. Everything." "Maybe," Catherine acknowledged. "Or maybe people will respect honesty and redemption more than they respect a man hiding behind money. But either way, I won't live under blackmail. I won't build a life with you while Vivian Chen holds this over our heads. We face it together or not at all." The Astor Midsummer Gala was 2 weeks away, the perfect venue for Catherine's plan, and during those 2 weeks she and Marcus worked together in ways they never had before, true partners united by purpose if not yet by love. They drafted a statement acknowledging the factory fire, Marcus's responsibility, the years of guilt and isolation that had followed. They established the Margaret Chen Worker Safety Fund with an initial endowment of $100,000. They implemented new safety standards across all of Marcus's factories, standards that would serve as a model for the industry. And they prepared for the social fallout, knowing this gamble might cost them everything but choosing honesty over fear, redemption over hiding. The night of the gala, Catherine wore deep blue that made her look like strength personified, and Marcus stood beside her looking less like the Ice Baron and more like a man facing judgment with dignity, and when Catherine addressed the assembled crowd of New York's elite, you could have heard a pin drop. She spoke for 10 minutes, laying out the full truth of Margaret's death, Marcus's failures, the blackmail, and their decision to face consequences rather than continue paying for silence. She announced the safety fund and the reforms. And she ended with words that would be quoted in newspapers for weeks: "We cannot change the past. But we can honor those who died by ensuring their deaths meant something, that Margaret Chen's passion for worker safety becomes her lasting legacy rather than just a tragedy. My husband failed his first wife. He will spend the rest of his life trying to do better. That's all any of us can do: fail, learn, and try to be better." The silence after Catherine finished speaking lasted an eternity, and then, unexpectedly, someone began to applaud. Then another. Then more, until the ballroom filled with the sound of 800 people acknowledging courage if not condoning past failures, respecting honesty enough to give Marcus and Catherine a chance at redemption. Vivian Chen stood at the edge of the crowd, her power evaporated in an instant, her blackmail worthless now that the truth was public, and she left without a word, defeated by the very weapon she tried to wield. Marcus took Catherine's hand in front of everyone, raised it to his lips, and said clearly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I love you. I should have said it weeks ago, but I was afraid. I'm done being afraid." It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because real life is messier than fairy tales, more complicated, but it was something better, a beginning built on truth, on choice, on two people deciding that despite everything, despite the transactional nature of their marriage's start, despite Marcus's guilt and Catherine's sacrifice, despite all the reasons it shouldn't work, they would try to build something real together. The months that followed brought both challenges and unexpected joys. Some business associates cut ties with Marcus, others respected his honesty and stayed. The Workers' Safety Fund became Catherine's passion project, giving her purpose beyond being Mrs. Marcus Thorne, allowing her to make a real difference in the lives of factory workers across New York. Marcus learned, slowly and with difficulty, how to be emotionally present, how to share his thoughts and fears instead of hiding behind work and control. They argued sometimes, because growth is never smooth, because learning to love after trauma takes time and patience and willingness to fail and try again. But they kept trying, and that trying mattered more than perfection. 1 year after their wedding, they hosted an anniversary celebration at Ironwood Manor that bore no resemblance to their cold first ceremony, this one filled with laughter and genuine warmth, attended by factory workers and society figures alike, a physical representation of how far they'd come. As the evening wound down and guests departed, Marcus pulled Catherine aside to the library where they'd first begun really talking, where they played chess and built the foundation of their unlikely partnership. Happy? He asked, the same question he'd asked on their wedding night when the answer had been a resounding no. Getting there, Catherine responded, smiling. You. Marcus pulled her close, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that still surprised them both. Getting there, he echoed. Every day, a little more. And that was enough. Not perfect, not a fairy tale, but real and honest and worth fighting for, a marriage that had begun in ice but was learning, slowly, to thaw. Love stories don't always start with passion, sometimes they start with survival. Sometimes two people marry for all the wrong reasons and discover along the way that they've built something worth keeping. Marcus and Catherine's journey from transaction to partnership to love wasn't easy, wasn't simple, wasn't the romance either of them imagined, but it was theirs, built on honesty and choice and the courage to keep trying even when failing seemed easier. If this story of duty transformed into devotion, of frozen hearts learning to feel again, of redemption found in the most unlikely places resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Catherine's position? Would you have married the Ice Baron? Would you have stayed after learning about his role in Margaret's death? Would you have been brave enough to expose the truth publicly, or would you have continued paying for silence? Share your thoughts, and if you want more stories of Victorian and Gilded Age romances where love emerges from unexpected places, where duty and desire collide, where broken people find ways to heal each other, subscribe and join us next time for another tale of historic hearts and hard-won happiness. Because sometimes the best love stories are the ones that almost didn't happen, the ones built not on love at first sight but on the daily choice to see each other, truly see each other, and decide that together is better than apart.